Welcome to Module 3's continuation of MIDD Impact and Decision-Making focusing on pediatric drug development. My name is Jeff Barrett, and I have been involved in various aspects of pediatric drug and vaccine development for over 30 years. Likewise, I've been involved with developing and utilizing quantitative approaches to facilitate both adult and pediatric drug development over the same time frame. My intention for this session is to decompose the behind-the-scenes activities of various MIDD practitioners and decision makers to illustrate both the timing and the planning involved, and also to show via examples how this approach influences critical decisions on behalf of sponsors and regulators. In reality, pediatric drug development has existed over a relatively short timeline, especially in the context of both litigation and regulation that mandates pediatric research and development for products with a potential pediatric treatment population and enforces compliance with such requirements. Both the US and EU timelines are shown, but this is entirely a global consideration, as you should appreciate. Sponsors face many challenges to develop drugs for children. This figure illustrates this point with some of the more common concerns that most can appreciate. While some are familiar or similar for adults, some are entirely unique to pediatrics. So we might look at a decision such as choosing the right endpoints, picking good biomarkers, picking the dose, for instance, as something that's common to both adult and pediatric programs. But specifically looking at age requirements and age-appropriate formulations, juvenile animal considerations, the extrapolation ability from both preclinical and clinical data. These are all challenges that are unique to pediatric drug development, as well as some of the other design constraints, such as limiting sampling requirements to deal with small volumes for children. From the standpoint of project teams charged with managing the development programs, this slide illustrates the challenges in the context of regulatory reporting. At the very beginning, defining the pediatric population of interest is a critical first step that all project teams must face. You have to find the patients and then consider the global and marketplace considerations. Defining the target, of course. What's the relevance of the target to the intended pediatric indication? Does the mechanism of action make sense for the pediatric indication? Target alignment with pediatric route of administration and formulation strategy. These are all very relevant for a pediatric clinical development plan, and is also some of the questions that the project teams spend quite a bit of time and also requires multidisciplinary input. Model-informed drug development creates unique opportunities for pediatric drug development, since many of the approach's assets, and by assets we mean models, data sets, and assumptions regarding the pharmacokinetics and/or the pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamic relationships in adults, whether or not these can be extended and/or modified to address pediatric concerns. A lot of what you see articulated in this table is also the habit of both integration of the various data types, the habit of simulation to consider scenarios perhaps at the extremes of those factors being considered, as well as optimizing individual experiments so that the data generated are, number one, informative, but two, that they fulfill regulatory expectations. So this is all part of the habit that good companies are investing in, as well as regulators should expect them to do so. And again, it rolls up into the bottom right-hand part of this table into decisions. Can I support the decisions either by the data that I've accumulated or by the model scenarios we've been able to test? That's all part of the habit. With these assets in place, pediatric-specific model-informed drug development deliverables can be constructed and utilized by the project team or sub-team members to facilitate decision-making. Examples are shown in the middle box. So it's not enough to just generate pharmacokinetic information, but being able to make estimates of the variability around key pharmacokinetic parameters. Understanding what covariants might be in place that are specific to pediatric populations, for example. Being able to minimize the number of samples so that we don't run into concerns for volume constraints for sampling children and neonates potentially. And obviously integrating interactions with impaired organs or organs under maturational consideration, and we're talking about the very young populations. Combining preclinical and adult data. These are all things that have to be done in order to develop a pediatric-specific habit, and also the asset. There exists diversity in both the model categories and types, as well as data sets required to inform each model. The subtext for this fact is also a requirement of a multidisciplinary team and approach in order to complete these efforts. This is no longer the domain of the DMPK and clinical pharmacology groups alone. Clearly, there's the intention to leverage the expertise from the entire project team, but also to have them own the assets and own the decision made from the assets. This slide illustrates the planning and timing requirements, so you may ask the question of when this should occur. Clearly, it has to occur at the time of project team creation. The very first draft of the target product profile should include the initial plans and thoughts around the pediatric indication, where it exists, and the prevalence of the pediatric disease specific. Being able to link stage gate milestones such as the first time in pediatric dose selection, pediatric endpoints, and pediatric clinical trial designs. All of these are expected at the very beginning and rolled up into the initial draft of the target product profile. In terms of who, again, this should be a co-investment from the entire project team that are sponsoring the project. It should be coordinated in terms of available resources to conduct the work, but also the complementary pieces such as assembling the data and on the clinical operations to conduct the trial as specified by the modeling team. And clearly it must be endorsed by senior management. The how is up for the project team to decide, but this is a key concern in terms of the allocation of both internal resources and perhaps outsourcing capabilities if that's what's required. Landscaping of the available and relevant data sources needs to be done at the very beginning and reevaluated as the team continues to generate data and look for data from competing efforts. The continuation of this effort should not be underestimated. The timing requirements dictate that planning is essential to ensure that the deliverables are completed in time to influence the decision making. If this doesn't happen in time, it's wasted effort. Resource allocation and buy-in are likewise essential to the planning. So in terms of the what, we're talking about the inventory of available MIDD assets for the entire program, data availability, existing models, thought leaders, identification of subject matter experts. These can be involved at early stages to advise a team, but they can also be involved to review critical elements of regulatory deliverables, such as briefing documents and publications. Software, hardware, and personnel that are used to support the various efforts likewise need to be budgeted for, and those resources need to be allocated with a specific percent effort budgeted and part of the planning. It must be ensured that these stage deliverables appear in the project plans and are regularly updated to project teams based on progress. Obviously, the project team investment and engagement are critical to ensuring that the work gets done, but also that the timelines are met. Identifying resource gaps and considerations of outsourcing requirements, if necessary, need to be engaged and reevaluated over time. And clearly, there needs to be endorsement from senior management. This again, is not something that is done in a vacuum or in a closet. The nature of the activities and the interconnectedness of the various models make it difficult to catch up. So if you don't get started early, it again just puts more burden on the team. The model-informed drug development efforts are becoming an important part of the valuation when purchasing a product or company. So it's clearly an asset that's reviewed favorably by the acquiring partner. Likewise, regulators should expect to see this kind of well-supported and articulated progression and outputs as part of a rigorous, carefully planned process. If it's not there in the submission materials, you may want to know why. A well-defined regulatory process has created multiple opportunities to share the details of decision-making at critical drug development milestones. This is true for both adult and pediatric development. Regulators should likewise expect to see MIDD deliverables communicated as part of the decision-making rationale and dialogue. So clearly, and this is again just showing a TPP template here, there's multiple opportunities for sponsors to summarize this information, to put it together in digestible format, and to provide it for regulatory input and guidance. Let's walk through a few examples. Perhaps the most visible example is the manner in which MIDD supports or can support pediatric dose selection. So when we speak about dose, obviously this is a fundamental requirement for both adult and pediatric development programs. And in this case, the sponsor needs to understand the indication, the target population, both adult and pediatric, and the age range of interest, as well as the desired exposure at the site of action. So from those initial features around dose requirements should come a strategy around how to get the active amount to the site of action. So those are all embedded into a dose rationale strategy. This dose selection and rationale are necessary elements to be articulated in protocols, investigators' brochures, and regulatory submission documents. So a variety of such documents exist for global regulatory authorities such as the PIP, the PSB, the INDs, and the NDA themselves, as well as briefing documents. They're clearly shared with the investigators who are participating in the study as well. Two approaches are often considered to support pediatric dose selection. They are not mutually exclusive, and quite often both are utilized to evaluate the robustness of the decision. When only one approach is put forward, it is often because of the availability of data required to inform a particular model type, but may also be influenced by the data quality, assumptions, and/or hypothesis required for the various models as well. So we're going to talk about in the next few slides the distinguishing features between what we're calling a top-down and a bottom-up approach. Again, there's lots of resources available to get more information in both of these categories, but I think a short walkthrough will get you comfortable. It's always relevant to compare pediatric and adult pharmacokinetics and PK/PD data and relationships. This is obviously an expectation if we're going to consider the generalizability from adult to pediatric populations. And it's implicit in a top-down approach which utilizes adult data as a modeling anchor and benchmark to compare the expected pediatric PK and/or PK/PD response to various dosing scenarios. So we have an expected flow here where we'll look at different doses of considered interest. We'll look at the exposures generated in this scenario relevant to what's been studied already in adults. So having done the work in adults, there should be the ability to generate PK distributions in the adult data and then compare that to the distributions that could be generated via a model across intended age and weight subpopulations of interest. And then compare the projected exposure and/or exposure response across the different age considerations and estimate the sample size required to detect a difference in key pharmacokinetic variables, such as clearance and volume distribution as an example. And then using standard statistical approach, being able to compare subgroups via analysis of variance and looking at the delta to define an important difference and the sample size required to show a difference if one exists. And finally, to look at sampling scheme that will yield meaningful parameters. So it's not enough to say that we're just going to reduce samples. Samples have to be justified in terms of their timing and number, and this can be accomplished via simulation scenarios. These are all part of the top-down approach. Complementary to that approach, we have a bottom-up approach which requires a more extensive list of model parameters to evaluate pediatric dosing scenarios, but does have advantages with respect to flexibility, physiologic representation, and the ability to handle both route of administration and formulation differences more easily. So in this context, a lot of data around the drug molecule itself and then any active ingredients is also incorporated as inputs into the model, but it does also benefit from historical physiologic data in both adults and pediatric subpopulations to consider this physiologic framework, and then incorporating drug-specific parameters around absorption and distribution to construct scenarios consistent with this model type that allow us to consider what is the benefit of changing the formulation characteristics and or giving a different route of administration. Now, regardless of the choice of model, regulators can be assured that either the PIP or the PSP will contain a rationale for how pediatric dosing was arrived at, along with supportive documentation referring to the recommendation. Hence, a model-informed drug development understanding allows the reviewer to appreciate the sponsor's beliefs, assumptions, and recommendations more fully. So there is an advantage to investing in learning this topic to get more comfortable with the approach so that when you read this rationale, you understand where it came from. This slide illustrates the behind-the-scenes activities and processes in place in order to construct a physiologically based PK model as an example, supporting pediatric dose recommendations with the expectation of getting feedback from regulatory authorities. So what I show you here is the nature of different data types that come into the various iterations of the model the expectation that the model will be shared and there will be a confirmation process engaged. So this is clearly not something that, again, should happen in a vacuum. And because, as I showed you on the previous slides, with the opportunities to discuss this with regulatory authorities, the sponsor should never feel that they're doing this in a vacuum, that they can't get regulatory buy-in and opinions about the model specificity, the precision of the model, and the expected outputs of the model. So this, again, is an opportunity for collaboration and also an opportunity to get the model reviewed to be considered a drug development tool that could be useful for multiple sponsors, not just the sponsor submitting it. But it does allow, again, regulatory feedback and interaction. Another common example and opportunity for pediatric drug developers is the impact of MIDD to inform formulation development, which is a key for pediatric acceptance, compliance, and clinical performance. As one pediatric investigator often told me, the bioavailability of a pediatric dose is 0 in a child who refuses to take the drug or spits it out in some fashion. So clearly, formulation is a key consideration. And in this case, the models is help. They'll allow sponsors the opportunity to consider different types of formulations, not just from the standpoint of clinical performance and as far as achieving exposure requirements, but also in the acceptability and suitability of the formulation itself. To illustrate this, I show on this slide the complexity of considerations that are often in play for a pediatric formulation development program. It's especially daunting when one considers that any one of these boxes can go awry. So there's a lot that needs to be confirmed along the way. But what I should make clear here is that the tools that we talked about, particularly a PBPK model, if it does incorporate some of these other factors such as solubility, permeability characteristics, allows the formulation developer to consider, before they actually do an experiment, scenarios that may be considered perhaps more palatable to a child and also reflect the targets in terms of PK/PD requirements. So another place where an MIDD approach makes a lot of sense and potentially saves time and money. This slide illustrates the benefit of a modeling platform that can accommodate previous efforts, particularly in the case, for example, of physiologically based pharmacokinetic models, so that pediatric considerations can happen in a more streamlined manner and in the context of an adult model of the same drug. This is a huge benefit for both scenario testing and evaluating probability of technical success. So again, the sponsor, by purchasing this kind of a platform, can create a library of similar models so that models of a similar ilk, either because the biopharmaceutics are similar or the therapeutic area is similar or the intended age range, all of those factors allow borrowing from previous efforts to be incorporated into future modeling efforts. So it's an incredible time saver and potentially financial saver for the sponsor to invest in such models. And again, I would say most regulators have access to this, so the developers of these tools will often provide them to regulatory authorities. So it's nothing that incurs any additional financial expense from this standpoint. And it's also a means by which these models can be transferred more seamlessly so that there's no opportunity for further manipulation. The model that the sponsor used can be exactly transferred into regulators' environments. Key appreciation for MIDD for pediatric research and development is often the justification and optimization of the pediatric clinical development program, including both the number and nature of proposed clinical trials. So I show on this slide this continuity of both proposing an initial framework discussion around this belief system, the assumptions, the data required relative to the clinical development plan, identifying the number of studies required and the nature of those with well thought out scenarios, consideration for different design types, different sample size requirements. So all of these would roll up into a trial simulation strategy that the sponsor would use to justify its recommendations, but also an opportunity to share the thought process with regulators. Complementary approaches are often helpful to establish confidence in the modeling results and the fidelity of the various drug development tools, including the sponsor's plans and recommendations. This is embedded in the FDA's drug development tool context of use guidance. So clearly there's a good track record for these kinds of relationships to have happened, and where regulators and sponsors have worked together to develop meaningful plans and be on the same page in terms of strategies and implementation. The pediatric MIDD effort is often an evolving process. The effort is never wasted. Confidence in the various models grows as they are challenged and updated by new data over time in response to various experiments and clinical investigations. So what you see on this slide is really illustrative of the fact that these models change and evolve over time. And in this case, showing that when different types of formulations are generated, that they can embed it into a broader context for the modeling, that this type of borrowing information where more pediatric specific data is generated becomes, again, a place where the precision of the model estimates improves with the addition of data. So there's an expectation that this is going to happen. It should be shared with regulators, and it should weigh into regulatory decision making. Again, some sponsors do this seamlessly well, and others hopefully will get the message as they see more of this information. Reviewers should expect to see well-articulated plans addressing pediatric research and development efforts from sponsors. These plans are likely to be informed by MIDD deliverables. Models can be an asset to reviewers, and good examples exist where reviewers have asked sponsors to either reevaluate their models or rerun scenarios under different conditions. As the quality and diversity of these models grows, it behooves both sponsors and regulators to stay informed and communicate regularly and transparently. So again, I think there's fantastic examples here, but clearly not everyone gets the email. It's something where being able to communicate with confidence, the good vibrations of this approach is something that you expect to see part of the dialogue between regulators and sponsors. In conclusion, I will say that there's many references where these examples exist. I encourage you to dig into the subtext in the materials. Again, the entire faculty for this training is available and can answer questions. The majority of them have pediatric specific knowledge. And as you can see from this list, some of these references are even 20 years old.